Shalom. So hopefully, uh, people can hear and see me. I'm hoping on my streams. I am just going to make sure you guys can hear the video.
By the Reverend Dr. Stephen DeYoung. He is a pastor of Archangel Gabriel.
Okay, so it appears everything is working. So I am going to start. Shalom. Kalipa, I believe that's how you say it, asked me to respond to Father DeYoung coming on on gospel simplicity and speaking. And so I decided to go ahead and make this response video, even though I had kind of decided I wasn't going to respond to this. Even though I obviously watched it, I'm a big fan of Father DeYoung, um, as well as a big critic, but I'm a big critic of everything. Father DeYoung is uh, a proponent of what he calls Paul within Judaism. And unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read his book. I don't think I'm going to get a chance to read his book. I've been not doing a lot of things I need to be doing anyway. Um, so I didn't feel it was quite fair to talk about his position without really, as much as I do, without really giving him a fair hearing. I mean, obviously, I very much obviously knows what he's talking about, and I want to make that clear. I'm not trying to say that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He does. What I think is important is to realize that his narrative, the way he describes things, isn't necessarily what I would say is um, has to be the way. And of course, he has his narrative, and I have my narrative. And I think, well, honestly, I mean, this is a place where there is limited information. There's a lot more invested in the views than most other topics. There are a lot of people over interpreting the information as being dispositive for them. And honestly, so there there are views which are, I would say, obviously wrong, right? And a lot of those views, unfortunately, are the traditional Christian views. And so there have, as this discussion has developed, and this discussion has been developing for well over a century, that has to be emphasized. That I don't, I mean, while some of the things that Father DeYoung might be saying might be considered new, especially relatively new, because we're talking about a subject that's been discussed for a good 2,000 years. Um, really, uh, we are hashing out the academics and information that has been bubbling up through a, a real examination, a fair examination of these ideas, which were very much suppressed within Christianity over the past 2,000 years, right? Um, and I highly recommend, I always keep on recommending the Great Disputation, reading the account of the Disputation of Barcelona by Nahmanides, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman. He, as well as being one of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history, uh, he was involved in a disputation with an apostate Jew who had become a Catholic priest at before the king in Barcelona, and Nahmanides wrote his own version of what happened there. And honestly, the only honest assessment of what happened was that he soundly defeated his opponent, and because of that, he was forced into exile. And I mean, this is the environment within which Jewish Christian dialogue took place for thousands of years. Um, Christians were burning people at the stake, were murdering people for disagreeing with them. Um, and so when that became untenable, a whole host of questions started coming up. And that's part of the reason why there are Unitarians, why so much, well, first, a lot of Christian doctrine through the Reformation started being questioned. And then, as an extension of that, um, other things started being questioned, and lots of things started being questioned. And so we're still in the middle of all of that. And in response to a lot of the questions that once large numbers of people had access to this information and the Bible itself, and the questions and the ability to speak freely, Christianity had to start reforming itself and its view of Jesus and view of its relationship with Judaism and its relationship with Paul of Tarsus, who I affectionately refer to as Baal of Tarsus. Um, and so this stream of scholarship, and I would say it is apologetic scholarship by people like N.T. Wright and Father Stephen, is an attempt to salvage Christianity. Um, and honestly, I think it's really problematic, and I think it fails. And I think what Bo Branson actually said um, on Sam Adams's channel. This is a video that came out a few days ago. Isaiah Burridge, Bo Branson on Sam Adams' channel, Transfigured. And what he explains here, I think, is really important, and that's why I wanted to play it. Uh, I mean, I obviously I recommend reading, watching the video itself, but what he says here is really important.
Here's what I think. if you think about things just from the point of view of actual inductive logic or probability theory, the way that some Christians carry on some biblical debates, I think, is a really bad idea if you do believe in inerrancy, because what they end up doing is actually stacking up a lot of evidence against it, and it's inadvertent, because I know what they're doing is assuming inerrancy, and then they don't think that they need to worry about the fact that they've just mounted up a massive case against inerrancy, right? So here's the idea. I mean, the basic idea is just, look, if you've got, let's say you flip two coins, right, and maybe they both come up heads, maybe they're both tails, maybe one's one, the other, maybe the other's the other. Those are independent issues, right? So if I give you a ton of evidence that this head or this coin is going to come up heads, right? I say, this isn't really a fair coin. I've flipped it 100 times. It's come up heads like 98 times. Like, this one's probably going to come up heads, right? And somebody else says, well, this other thing is going to come up heads too, right? And I've got, it's 98% certain or whatever. There's nothing magical that makes it so that if this one comes up heads, then this other one has to come up tails, right? There's no connection between them. So if you've got a bunch of evidence for this, a bunch of evidence for this, you just got a bunch of evidence that they're both going to come up heads, right? So similarly, like, if a Trinitarian points to a verse in the Bible and says, this looks really Trinitarian, like, just read it, and here's my argument, and here's the context, whatever. It's like 99% certain that the Bible is saying something Trinitarian here, right? Then a Unitarian comes along and is like, well, but it's 99.99999% certain that this verse over here is Unitarian, right? What you've really done is just put together an argument to show that the Bible has contradicted itself, and that you're 99 point something, so whatever the math is, right, that you're pretty sure, you should be pretty sure at the conclusion of that the Bible is just saying contradictory things. And that's not what you want to do, right? What you want to do is say that the Bible is consistently Trinitarian, or that it's consistently Unitarian, or at least it's consistently something, right? So what you have to do is go in, and we talk about, in epistemology, sometimes we talk about what we call defeaters. So it's like, you've got an argument for some conclusion, and you have different ways of coming in and defeating that argument. So one way to do that is what we call a rebutting defeater, where you just prove that the opposite is actually true. Another kind of defeat is an undercutting defeater, where you just show that argument had a flaw in it, and it doesn't really count as supporting anything. So what I want to do is just say, look, if I've got my Trinitarian proof text and it's 99% certain that it's saying something Trinitarian, and Sam, you've got your Unitarian proof text and it looks 99% sure that it's saying something Unitarian, we can't just, like, I can't just keep stacking stuff up on the Trinitarian side, right? Because all that does is just make it even more likely
for Bart Ehrman or something to come in and say,
yeah,
that's they're different, and my model is better than either of your models, because I say that there are two models. Yeah.
So there you go. And this, I mean, hopefully this was clear. It's a sophisticated argument I think a lot of people haven't really considered, right? Which is, when you're looking at the Bible, one of the possibilities is that the fact that these things contradict each other is just telling you that you have an incoherent narrative. And that's something I keep on stressing, because that is my position. I'm not Bart Ehrman. I believe that the God of Israel actually is God, right? And the God of the Old Testament is God. And so whenever Christians attack Judaism, right, which they do constantly, and honestly, I mean, that's the problem with Paul, right? If he's right that Judaism's just bad as a religion, right? Well, isn't that just proof that Christianity is bad as a religion? Yeah, it is. And so Christians have had to start backtracking, I would say, right? And start undoing all of the ways in which they attacked Judaism. And there's been various ways of trying to do this, right? One of them, unfortunately, is by cherry picking scholars that say even incredibly offensive and ridiculous things and elevating them. For example, Michael Heiser, and the whole Madison School, University of Wisconsin, Madison Department of Hebrew Bible, just comes out with incredibly, I would say, offensive, right? Um, Ideas that generally an evangelical would recoil at, but because they have their back against the wall, evangelicals are now promoting these types of arguments which Michael Heiser made. Um, and by the way, I wish him the best. He's been having health problems, unfortunately. Um, but so I mean, I'm not picking on him particularly. There are, you know, I would say Dr. Michael Brown similarly, right? So um, bad scholars, I would say, get elevated by people who hope that by espousing these bad arguments and bad scholarship, they can kind of salvage their position. Now, there are other people, and I would say Pastor Tanner is one of these, and Paul Vanderklay is one of these, and um, Father Stephen DeYoung is one of these, who are trying to salvage, right? They are trying to understand, trying to make a coherent argument that is that doesn't check your brain at the door the way Pastor Tanner calls it, right? You don't want your religion checking your brain at the door, and unfortunately, I mean there are a certain number of people, and to some extent, I think Isaiah really espouses this quite clearly. Okay, there are inconsistencies. I don't care. I believe what I believe, right? And so, I mean, somebody like that, while we can have a discussion, um, obviously, coherency of the Bible isn't something that bothers him as much as I think it does me or Sam or Bo Branson and a lot of people in our little corner of the internet, right? So trying to come up with a, an acceptable narrative, right, uh, is incredibly important. It, you have to be able to map the territory of your religion in a way that fits all the data points that we have. And part of what is going on here, um, with Father Stephen, as opposed to Bart Ehrman, as opposed to me, as opposed to Bo Branson or Sam, is we have so many data points and we're trying to make sense of it, right? And that's why I keep on refreshing the the overall narrative. I think it's important to keep in mind, right, that we are actually offering different views of, I guess the word is soteriology, right? How is salvation is how Christians really look at it, right? Whereas I would say relationship, right? What defines our covenantal relationship with God, right? And so within Judaism, we've had and we continue to have this idea that God has separate. First of all, God has individual relationships with each individual person, right? But also that various nations, various people groups have their own way of relating to God. Um, and so this is again why the covenant of Noah keeps on coming up again, right? Because the traditional Christian explanation has been before Jesus, Judaism said God only likes the Jews, God hates everybody else, right? And and everybody who's not Jewish is, to quote Paul's words, right? Not not you know, not part of the household, not part of God's household. They can't refer to God as Father, right? Which is completely wrong because we're monotheists, unlike what Paul taught. And with when you do believe in monotheism, when you actually believe that there is one God, so we've always believed that God has had a relationship with all of humanity, right? And and that's why we have and have always had this concept of the covenant of Noah, which precedes the covenant at Sinai and the covenant with Abraham, that all of humanity has a relationship with God. And this is something that Christianity had to reject because it wasn't part of their narrative. Well, part of the problem is that historically we have a lot more information now. Jews aren't afraid to describe things um, as freely, um, which we were not able to do before, and we there has been a reaction of Jews actually starting to open up the Christian Bible and saying, "Hey, you've been trying to beat us over the head with this for so long. Look at the problems here, and there are significant and serious problems, right?" And so when Bo Branson talks about the problem of um, incoherence, it's not just a problem of Old Testament versus New Testament. It's a bigger problem, I would say, of New Testament against New Testament. And that's why I keep on saying the way you know that Paul of Tarsus is lying is that he tells you he's lying, and by looking at the Christian Bible, you can it itself tells you that Christianity is flawed in very important ways. And my narrative, the roadmap that I want to impress on people, and the branch I want to extend to Christians, is to see the miracle within that God has used Christianity to bring the Old Testament, the actual Bible, the Hebrew Bible, throughout the world, right? So that Christians can also benefit from the Hebrew Bible while at the same time Judaism preserved its role as non-evangelizing, as a as what basically I would say a refuge, right? That people who want to come, not a coercive, not not by the sword, not by the types of unfortunate tactics that Christians have have used for thousands of years, right? And to some extent, the disaster in many ways that Christianity has been, what people thought for evil has been God has used for good. Um, and so I want to once again go over some of the important. I think Acts, the book of Acts, is incredibly important, and a close reading of the book of Acts is incredibly important to understanding what's going on here. Because, I mean, frankly, I think the book of Acts, instead of being called the Acts of the Apostles, many people have said, should be called the Acts of Paul, which in fact it is. And I would say it should be called the Crimes of Paul, right? Because it is testimony to a crime, right? Which is Paul hijacking Christianity from what it was, and a roadmap to Christianity trying to go back to where it was, which is the Judaism that Father Stephen is trying to place Paul within. I don't think Paul himself can fit in there. I think if we are honest, we're going to have to go further than Father Stephen does, um, and and just reject Pauline Christianity completely for what actually Jesus taught, which was something very different, obviously. And I think it is obvious that Jesus taught. So what came up in academic circles was this idea that there was Jewish Christianity, which was what Jesus taught, and there was Pauline Christianity, which is what Paul taught, and um, the Jewish Christians were killed off and went away, right? And what we have now is Paul's corruption of Christianity. Well, this obviously did not sit well with Christians. So a new narrative started developing, which was no, 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 no. Paul actually wasn't what Paul was, you know, and that's what Father Stephen is going to be talking about, right? He's going to be rejecting this, what he calls a Protestant conception of Christianity. He's going to say, no, what the Protestants said about Paul and Christianity isn't true, and try to bring Paul back into the teachings of Jesus, which ultimately I think is impossible, but that's what he's going to try to do. Now, two parts of Acts I wanted to point out because I think they're just so important. In Acts 5, there's this scene where some of the apostles are caught and brought before the Sanhedrin, and Rabban Gamliel, right, is and Rabban Gamliel is still within certainly Pharisaic Judaism considered one of the greatest rabbis ever, although it might be a little anachronistic to refer to Gamliel the first as Rabban Gamliel, because during the Second Temple period, there really wasn't anybody called rabbis, which is another anachronism in the Gospels, right? When Jesus gets called a rabbi when there weren't any rabbis yet. But what happens is that Gamliel, who Paul, at least in Acts, claims is his teacher, I think in other places he also claims to be a Pharisee, and which I reject completely. But so Gamliel, verse 34. But a Pharisee named Gamliel, a teacher of the law who was honored by all the people, and this is, I mean, basically historically more accurate now than it was 2,000 years ago, because, there were more flavors of Judaism which existed. And this is part of the reason I'm reading this thing, because it is a flash of Judaism showing through the Christianity in the book of Acts. Stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed. All his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. His speech persuaded them. They called the apostles in and had them flogged. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. So there are two things I think is really important to take out of here. First of all, I do think that even whether or not this actually took place, it is a fair representation of the Pharisaic Jewish view of Christianity at the time, which conversely reflects something about the Christianity of the time. In Judaism, it's like, you want to believe Jesus was the Messiah, not going to agree with you, but okay, like, have at it. And so what later is described is Paul's persecution of the church on behalf of the high priest, who was a Sadducee, right? Which kind of says, well, hold on a minute. What is Paul telling us? And part of what he's telling us is he's a liar, right? Because the Pharisee position was, don't bother the Christians. And what does that tell us about the Christians? It tells us that the only point of disagreement was this idea of whether or not Jesus was the Messiah or not. The early Christians were, and you see this many times in Acts, it flows through the veil that Pauline Christians have put on, and the editing of the text, right? What is betrayed by a close reading of the text is that the early Christians actually kept the Torah, right? They were Jews who believed normal Jewish things in all ways except this one thing, which Rabban Gamliel is kind of like, why are you bothering? why are you let them be, right? Because at best it's worthless, and at worst you're actually working against something that's good. Halavai. Well, if only Jesus was the Messiah. And again, this really comes to a head and becomes obvious in Acts 15, and then again in Acts 21, when Paul comes up to who were the actual leaders, right? James, the brother of Jesus, was the actual leader, as we can see implied in the text. And he was kind of called to account for this teaching, which is unacceptable, right? And so this is chapter 21:17. Chapter 21:17. When he arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. So James was the leader, and Paul is showing deference to James, right? So this is where the idea that comes that there was a Christian, a Jewish Christian presence in Jerusalem, and the problem wasn't Jesus and his teachings and Christianity. The problem was Paul, and the problem was Paul. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, and it's really important to pay attention to what's going on here. You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed. So they've become part of this movement of Christianity, and all of them are zealous for the law. So you have a strong Christian presence within Jerusalem, right, of Jews who are zealous for the law, who are going to the temple, who are keeping the laws, who are doing all the things that Jesus and James and Peter taught, right? They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. And this is where Father DeYoung is going to get in, and he's going to try to kind of wedge Paul in here in a way of saying, well, Paul wasn't doing that. He wasn't going against James. He wasn't going against Jesus. He was only going against, well, some people say only going against that which was not taught by Moses and the Torah, but taught by the rabbis, which also doesn't make sense because of so many other things, right? Or what Father Stephen is trying to show is no. He's just saying that those things which set Israel apart, right? Those ritual laws are what was gotten away with, but the things that aren't ritual laws, right? So, for example, eating foods sacrificed to idols. No. Those are still in place. Moses, so he's basically rejecting the book of Hebrews, right? The idea that the law was training wheels, a lot of things that Paul actually taught, right? He's trying to undo that. And I think it is important to really focus on the word circumcise here, because what James is saying is no. We still believe, as was from the time of Moses, that Jews should circumcise their children, and Gentiles don't need to do that. And for Paul, the problem was he didn't want this, apparently, although it's hard to tell. I mean, Paul was an inveterate liar. That's part of what we see is, I mean, he's saying one thing to James, and we can see in his letters that he was saying the opposite, right? So, trying to make one coherent whole of a liar who says different things to different people. I mean, honestly, I made that whole video, Paul's Gospel of Deception, and that is what Paul is and who Paul is, right? A deceiver. Um, but it this is, I believe, where Father DeYoung and a lot of the things he's going to be saying falls apart, right? Um, what shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join the purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. And um, as for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. This is going back to Acts 15. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. And there was a huge reaction because some Jews from Asia, and by this they mean Asia Minor, the places where Paul had actually been going around and lying to people and saying precisely those things which James is confronting with him. They're like, "Hey, hold on! You were telling us something completely different. Now you're telling James something completely different. What's going on here, right?" And so you'll notice Father DeYoung is going to say that, oh, the Christians still went to the temple, but they didn't offer sacrifices for sin offerings. Sorry, it's not correct. They were actually doing sin offerings because this Nazarite vow, which they had Paul do, included a sin offering. And so again, he's trying to thread a very particular needle, right? And I don't think it works, and it doesn't work. But there's a reason why he's doing that, because otherwise you're going to have precisely what Bo Branson was talking about, which is people realizing this is in an incoherent mass that you're going to have to reject. Okay, so with all of that, I spent a good 40 minutes talking. Let's go ahead and start listening to what he's saying. And one more bit of cautionary thing here. I think there's a lot of places where Father DeYoung is trying very hard to skate within the lines that I'm very glad he is skating within the lines of. But unfortunately, the people who are listening to him are not aware of how carefully he is wording things in order to allow them to keep the thoughts and the misconceptions which are so common among Christians. Okay? Okay, so let's start.
Gabriel Orthodox Church in Lafayette, Louisiana. He is also the host of the Whole Counsel of God podcast from Ancient Faith and author of the Whole Counsel blog, as well as co-host of the very popular Lord of Spirits podcast. He is also the author of the recent book, which we'll be discussing today, The Religion of the Apostles, Orthodox Christianity in the First Century. I might also add,
unfortunately, I haven't read the book, and that's part of the reason why I wasn't going to do a commentary. Hopefully there's nothing in there that would change my mind. I don't know.
One of my most requested guests of late, and I've had lots of joy in telling people who say, oh, I can't wait till you have Father Stephen DeYoung on that. Just wait, it's going to happen soon. So, Father Stephen DeYoung, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And Father Stephen is really popular, especially I think in our corner of the internet, because he really does know his stuff. It's actually quite refreshing.
for inviting me, and hopefully I won't disappoint all those people now. The pressure is on.
Oh, no, I am sure they will enjoy it thoroughly. So we were just talking about your book before we went live here, and you were mentioning just how it's done really well for ancient faith. I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to know because something you mentioned was that the book is a little different than what most of ancient faith publishes. What inspired you to write this book? What's kind of the backstory there?
Yeah, so in terms of books I write, in the Orthodox world, in the United States in particular, but the English-speaking Orthodox world in general, there are certain things that we have a lot of in terms of translations and literature. And then there are other things that we have not a lot of or none of. Even things that we have a fair amount of, like translations of the Church Fathers, they're kind of spotty and kind of focused, right, on certain things. So for example, with the Church Fathers, anything having to do with the doctrine of the Trinity or Christology or these sort of main central theological things, we have translated. But some of the more obscure things or niche things, vast amounts of that is still untranslated. But so once I finished my PhD, I said, well, I'm qualified for a certain part of that lack, right? To fill a certain part of that hole. And I didn't want to start writing my version or my take on things that already exist, because there's too much we don't have in English. And so my goal is to write things to fill those holes where we don't have it in the English Orthodox world yet. And so this book was really trying to put together sort of a one-volume biblical theology from an Orthodox perspective, which is something that didn't really exist in English before this. And you probably noticed with your background that I sort of structured it, and in terms of the table of contents, structured it in a way that would be familiar to English-speaking readers of other similar biblical theologies and those kind of things. I think the contents are different because it's coming from an Orthodox perspective, but at least the structure of the ideas is something that's a little more familiar. And that's what really inspired me to put this together and to lead off with it.
Yeah.
So basically, I would say, I mean, like I've been saying, there's been an attempt to kind of make a reasoned and coherent narrative that takes all the information we've had and goes ahead and makes what isn't coherent seem more coherent. And my biggest problem here is the people who don't even understand that Father DeYoung's narrative is defensible, as opposed to most traditional Christian views, pretty much I would say all traditional Christian views, which are indefensible. So people will attack him on the right, and I will agree with those attacks because the traditional Christian narrative does come from Pauline Christianity. And again, he's trying to reconcile Paulism with what Jesus taught, which I would say is irreconcilable.
Yeah, and I think you definitely accomplished that of kind of giving a structure that might feel familiar to those who don't always read Orthodox theology, perhaps, or come from a background of more evangelical circles where we read plenty of biblical theology as well. I shouldn't say we, those of us who are nerdy enough that actually care about this stuff. But, and yeah, it did feel familiar in that way. And then some of the content was definitely different, but also it covers this area that I've seen kind of, in looking through theology, a lot of interest in, but not from an Orthodox perspective, at least in my circles, and that is Second Temple Judaism. I kind of first cut my theological teeth on N.T. Wright and his work, and so that language of Second Temple Judaism has been a big thing, and it's been a big explosion in scholarly circles. But again, you kind of bring this Orthodox perspective to it that was really interesting and made a lot of connections there. However, before I jump all the way into that, for those that heard me say maybe 3 times in the past sentence and a half, Second Temple Judaism, what is this? Why should we care about this? And what role does this have in your book?
Right. So when we're dividing up sort of the history of Israel and Judea, it's divided into periods. So there's a period referred to as ancient Israel, and then there is the period of the first temple. So Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. We're in the 10th century BC, and that first temple then survives until the Babylonians destroy it, 587, 586 BC. That's the first temple period. And so then there's the 70 years of exile in Babylon for the people of Judah. When they return, they rebuild the temple. And so the period from roughly 500 BC through until AD 70, when the Romans destroy that temple, when that second temple exists, that's referred to as the Second Temple period. And so Second Temple Judaism is really referring to the religious beliefs and practice and world of the Judean people during that time, during those centuries.
I think what's really important to say here is it's really important because what is described as Second Temple Judaism is the environment out of which Jesus and Christianity came out of, right? And if you are not going to saw off the branch you're sitting on, right? If you are going to have a Christianity and a Jesus who affirms Judaism, right, as it existed before Jesus, then you have to be consonant with at least some conception of Second Temple Judaism. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to say, look, it's not that Judaism is false, therefore Christianity is false. It's not that Judaism has this view and Christianity has a different view, and either Judaism is true or Christianity is true, in which case you would have to say only Judaism is true because Christianity depends on Judaism. He's trying to say Judaism is true. Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism from which is the tree that Christianity kind of branched off from, is true, right? And Christianity is the valid expression of those eternal, godly, divine truths into modern day, right? It's a continuity which has to recognize, because again, going back to what Bo Branson said, well, if you're going to tell me that the Old Testament God was a horrible God, Christianity came out of the Old Testament, Bart Ehrman wins, right? And so he's trying to salvage that.
And we tend to think of religion in very modern terms. And that goes beyond the chronic problem that I'm trying to address in this book of sort of taking my local Orthodox Jewish synagogue and saying, oh, well, that must be exactly what they were doing in the first century, and just reading that back. But even just the idea that there was sort of a religion with a structure and a hierarchy and some kind of Jewish systematic theology or something during this period, which of course there wasn't, right? So the Judaism in Second Temple Judaism is really more like the way we talk about Hinduism, which is really just the religion.
No. It's so Judaism as it existed 2,000 years ago is not exactly as Judaism exists today, obviously, because there's been 2,000 years of history. And but to compare it to Hinduism, no. We still had our texts. We still had a single temple, a single God, and he's going way too far there.
Of the people of the Indus River Valley. So there's sort of this variety in Second Temple Judaism of Judean people in Palestine, in Egypt, in Ethiopia.
See, okay, so what happened, and this is generally accepted history, is that, yes, there was generally regional religions, right? And religions of various regions, right? And what conquering powers understood about that was, if you were to take a people away from their temple, away from their local cult, and I'm using the word not in a pejorative, they would be forced to change their religion, change who they were, right? And that is what the Babylonian captivity attempted to do with Judaism and failed, right? And that is at least how academics would describe how Judaism became a religion in the modern sense, unlike what he's describing right now. And this happened between the first and the second temple because during those 70 years, Judaism formed as a religion distinct from what he's describing. So no, this is just plain wrong.
Ethiopia, in Mesopotamia, in Western Europe, in this diaspora, who have this variety of beliefs and practices and perspectives, and trying.
Have book, will travel. That's how my ancient history professor described the religion of the Jews. And the Torah, as this unifying figure, made a huge difference and changed it from what he's describing.
To sort of survey that, to give us this broader understanding of the religious and intellectual world then that the apostles would have had and would have brought with them as they come to know Christ.
I really like that. And it goes back to what's essentially, for people who are Bible theology students, like day one, you learn this principle of you always want to be taking passages in context. And we have varying levels of success with that at times for sure. But this idea of, okay, we're going to look at the period and the cultural milieu from which the New Testament arose and from which like the Christian movement arose. And I think for Christians, this should be really interesting because something happened in the first century that sparked just so much change, but also we tend to think of it as all rift. So there was this, and then something completely new happened. But when we can understand where it's coming from, we can get kind of a better perspective on it, which is what a lot of your book talks about. And we're going to get into that in a second, but you made a point there that I want to highlight. And you said we often kind of paint the local Jewish synagogue back onto the first century as though those are the exact same things. And in your book, you talk a decent amount about this kind of rift between Second Temple Judaism and, now for everyone, a third period of Rabbinic Judaism. Can you talk about that a little bit and why that's so important?
Right. So there's when Second Temple Judaism, when the Second Temple is destroyed, and that period comes to an end, there are different movements that emerge from that. So certain forms of Judaism, or
no. So there weren't different movements that emerged from it. There were lots of movements within Second Temple Judaism, and after the destruction, most of them died out. And the Pharisees, which I would say, and the evidence is, were the most popular, certainly outside of Israel itself. The Pharisees became even stronger and monolithic. And so the Judaism that we have today is just Pharisaic, 99.9%. And so what he's saying, there were the Sadducees and the Zealots and the Essenes and, various, I guess, types of Jews and beliefs within Judaism during the Second Temple period. The destruction winnowed out pretty much all the other ones. And so, no, not what he's saying.
Judaisms, plural, which is a term that Jacob Neusner really pushed for, a Jewish scholar. We look at it as Judaisms. Certain of those sort of go away when the temple goes away. So the Sadducees, who we see in the New Testament, for example, their whole power base was around the temple priesthood. So no temple means no priesthood means, right, they sort of evaporate, right? And there are other groups like the Qumran community, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, who through the Roman sort of de-Judification project after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in Palestine and Judea, get sort of wiped out. But there are others that survive, and there's sort of two main threads that survive. One of those, of course, is Christianity, and the other one comes to be Rabbinic Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism has this historic road as well. It's not just that those who didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah continued on as they had, because, of course, their religious belief and practice was also centered around the temple and the sacrificial system.
Centered around the temple? See, again, I think he is overemphasizing something in order to allow people to believe things that are misconceptions. And one of those is that Judaism is, that modern Judaism is some sort of break from what existed before the destruction of the temple, similar to the break that there was between Pauline Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. And that's simply not true. And so, I mean, they're going to talk about this. I don't think he is being anti Semitic. The anti Semites, though, will have this concept of we're the real Jews, right? And the Jews are not Jews. And I will call that anti-Semitic. And he's allowing a version of that because in his description here, right, the religion created by the Gentiles out of Christianity, right, Pauline Gentile Christianity, is as authentic and as much a continuation of Judaism, right, as what the actual Jews did, which is false.
And all of these things that have now gone away. So they have this period of construction in the same way that we see a period over the early centuries leading into the church councils and these kind of things of where the Christian church sort of comes to flower right, in its fullness. So does Rabbinic Judaism. And so there's transformation that takes place. And these two groups don't do that in a vacuum. They're aware of each other, right? It's only in the 2nd century that they really definitively split. And even then, there's interaction back and forth and conversation, and they're reacting to each other. And it sounds very controversial to a lot of Christians to say that once the Talmud is formed in the 5th century, that it's formed in a lot of ways in reaction to Christianity.
So I think this is really important. There were things which Christians did which disgusted and revolted and revolts, that Jews, people who actually knew Judaism, looked at it in revulsion, and there was a reaction to how Judaism was being perverted by Christianity, right? And so one of the things he's going to get into, right, was during the Second Temple period, there were synagogues which would have the reading of the Torah in the Greek, and there were synagogues which would have it in the Hebrew with the Aramaic, right? And because Aramaic and Hebrew are similar enough, I think that's acceptable. And because of the Septuagint, which is the 5 books of Moses alone, only the 5 books of Moses are the actual Septuagint, there was an accepted translation into the Greek. And when Judaism, the actual Jews, saw how the Greek translation was being used and abused to basically destroy vital Jewish beliefs and things which were really important. So as a reaction, we became even more committed to learning Hebrew and the original word and against translation. He tries to make that sound like, well, the two are equally valid ways of continuing the understanding of Judaism. No. The Christian heresy, right, caused a reaction. He's not going to say, that it's kind of funny. It's the Catholics, especially the traditionalist Catholics, who end up in this problem, right? So in reaction to the Reformation, the Catholic Church had a counter-reformation and had certain things in reaction to the reformers, does that mean that the reformers are the actual Catholic Church? Well, it's even more absurd to try to say that about Judaism, because there is the Judaism that was adopted and kept by the Jews, right? People who were Jewish and knew about Judaism, and then this version of Judaism was created by the Christians, to which the Jews reacted, and he's trying to say that Christianity is as valid of an expression as Judaism is, of Judaism, of original Judaism. And this is honestly, it's appropriation. It is the type of appropriation that we do find problematic.
That's not controversial among Jewish scholars. A lot of the things in the book, and that I've said other places, I sometimes get feedback from Christians that they think they're worried I'm becoming anti-Semitic or something, or pushing in that direction, by saying that, for example, some things that we associate with Christianity, even core doctrines, are actually earlier than some of the things in Rabbinic Judaism. You know, they get a little.
Some of the doctrines within Christianity are earlier than some of the things within Rabbinic Judaism, arguably. Honestly, these are one of the things where he says things quite carefully, which I think the people listening to him don't really understand how carefully he's saying them.
Hesitant and worried about that. But if you look at what Jewish scholars are saying about the separation between Christianity and Judaism, they're pretty much in agreement with that. So yeah, we take for granted the historic road of Rabbinic Judaism, where there's this period where, for example, writing is forbidden. You have in the Second Temple period this very rich literature, right, that's going on in Jewish circles, all kinds of genres, all kinds of content being generated, and then that sort of immediately disappears in the second and third centuries, and even fourth centuries of Rabbinic Judaism. And Christians kind of keep it up. You have all this.
Right. So what happens is that in Judaism, there were what were considered holy writings, right? And everybody knew the Torah was the Torah, and certain things were accepted or not accepted as holy writings. And I think the Pharisees before Christianity really did keep to this idea that the oral law should be oral and should not be written down. But what happens with Christianity is suddenly they start adding their own supposed books to the Bible, and Judaism's like, no, right? Like, no, you don't, no. And he's implicitly criticizing that as something wrong, whereas honestly, what can I say? Yeah, the Jewish reaction has been very similar to how Christians react to the Book of Mormon.
Apocryphal Christian literature coming into existence, some of it heretical, later judged to be, some of it not. Christians keep writing, but they stop. And part of that is because they were looking at what the Christians were doing. They were looking at the New Testament documents. They were looking at these other things that were being written, and they were saying, we need to stop.
Right. They were being revulsed. Right. It was like, look at this. Stop. Like, yeah. And the implicit judgments here is what's bothering me.
We need to take stock. We need to decide what texts are authoritative, right? And we need to it was sort of a conservative move. And so teaching was done orally within that nascent.
Teaching was done orally before as well. And the proof of that is you have no writings by Jesus. You have no writings by Jesus. Jesus himself did not write anything. And obviously, I think we are all in agreement that Jesus knew how to write.
Rabbinic Judaism. And that's why when the Talmud is put in writing, it's all sort of these records of sayings of the great rabbis during that period. Here's what they were teaching. We're now
like the Gospel of Thomas.
Finally going to put it down on paper after the end of that oral period. So there is this process that produces Rabbinic Judaism as we know it today, in the same way that there over a few centuries, the Christianity that we know today takes form in the form that we now know it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's going to be helpful for people. And I think one of the really important ideas there is that road that Judaism takes leads it to, there are these divergent paths. And so we assume that, because today Christianity and Judaism might be, X feet apart, that they've always been that far apart. But then when you trace it back, there's trajectories there. You're able to get down to this question that you're ultimately asking in the book of, like, in what way is Orthodox Christianity kind of well, I'll let you use the words for how it represents Second Temple Judaism and the relationship to it, because I don't want to put words in your mouth there. But I think that's really helpful, and hopefully people are starting to put these pieces of the puzzle together as we go along here. One of the things that you mentioned was, and I believe you said it was from Jacob Neusner, the idea of Judaisms, which is something that I've had.
Father IRL Teddy Bear. I like Father IRL Teddy Bear. I would love to sit down and have a discussion with him.
Pushed in Old Testament biblical theology classes of this idea of not necessarily a monolithic Judaism at the time. And one point that you highlight that I think might again be one of these things that is seemingly scandalous to Christians, but maybe not to Jewish scholars, is this idea of monotheism in our very constricted sense of it being a hallmark of Judaism. That for us,
okay, now they're going to get into this thing which I also spoke on about on Sam's channel, which is this idea that because there were Jews who had certain ideas, that these ideas automatically become somehow okay to have. There were heretical Jews, and honestly, what the problem here is not viewing Jews as individuals and as real people who have a diversity of views. And I mean, anybody who's even looked at a single page of Talmud understands there's a wide diversity of views within what I would call is Orthodox Judaism, probably, I mean, best to call it lowercase Orthodox Judaism, at least at this point. And so if I find a single Jew who has a particular view, then suddenly that becomes a valid expression of Judaism, as opposed to a heretical small view. And I think a bigger problem is when you consider we aren't just having a discussion about a secular academic idea. We are talking about who is actually representing God's view of Judaism. Because ultimately, that is the question. And the fact that you can find even a majority of Jews at any time who believe a certain thing doesn't mean that that's what God approves of. And in fact, that's part of the reason I read what Rabban Gamliel said, supposedly said in Acts 5, because it is showing a very Jewish view, right? That not that because an idea is popular or lasts a long time that it's true, but that God is who decides history, who allows things to go forth in history. And what we see is that the movement which Gamliel was talking about in the Sanhedrin, right, which were simply Jews who kept the Sabbath, kept the laws, right? Because if the problem was these people were not keeping the Sabbath, these people were not keeping kosher, were not keeping all of the various laws, were not circumcising their children, then Gamliel's speech would have been very different, right? His speech wouldn't be, oh, leave them alone. It would be, these people are desecrating the Sabbath, the circumcision, kashrut, everything else, right? That's not what was going on, and that's that expression of Christianity that was following Judaism, that was within Judaism, disappeared, right? There are people who are trying to revive it, and honestly, as they are trying to revive it, they are feeding the Noahide movement, and um, there's become this progression of Christians who have started moving into the Messianic movement, and some of them are converting to Judaism, and some of them are becoming Noahides, which we've been talking about a lot.
Yes, maybe if you play a word association game, one of the first things you think of when someone says Judaism is monotheism, and there's definitely some truth in that for today. Like
some truth, some truth for today. See, this is the thing. If you believe that the Jewish texts, right, that the Shema is an important part of Judaism, and obviously it is, right? When you look at the texts, then it's not just an impression we get today of monotheism being important in the Old Testament. Open it up, read it. It is quite emphatic. There is a reason why Deuteronomy 6:4 does not show up anywhere in Christian liturgy except in like one night in in liturgy that only monastics read, right? The daily offices, right? On Saturday they encounter it once, right? As opposed to how it was within Second Temple Judaism. I don't think Father DeYoung would disagree that the Shema was recited constantly. It was something that was important, and it was something that Jesus said was really important. So, once again, no, it is not a misapprehension. It is not to say that monotheism is really important to Judaism. Monotheism is very important to Judaism, as opposed to Christianity.
Like that is a big part of Judaism. But you have several statements in there, one like this, where it says, for ancient Israelites and Second Temple Judeans, there was only one Yahweh, so yes, but he existed as multiple persons. Now, I think people might say,
okay, multiple persons? What is the Aramaic word for persons he's using here? I mean, honestly, this is one of the things where I want to read his book. What is he even saying? Right? The idea that God expresses himself in multiple ways, right? Yeah, that's non-controversial at all, right? And if that's all he's saying by this word persons, which is loaded with a lot of Christian myths. First of all, most Christians have no clue what they themselves mean when they talk about person. So, honestly, he's at the very least he's not making himself clear here.
say, what? Like that sounds crazy. Aren't Jews monotheists? How does that work? And I could see people saying,
and it's really funny that a Christian would say this because they are admitting that Christians are not monotheists, because once you have three persons, right? And I have to say this concept of many expressions of God, and that's what they mean by persons, is expressions, right? That God can be expressed in various ways, right? That the angel of the Lord shows up, or a cloud shows up, or a vision of an old man, or a vision of the chariot for Ezekiel, or right, as opposed to no, we have these three persons, we have these three gods that we believe in, which isn't monotheism. And the confusion here, they're never going to clear it up.
Yes, like it seems like later Christian writers read that into the Old Testament. They kind of worked it in there. But did Jews really believe that Yahweh existed as multiple persons? Hey, we'll be right back to the interview. But first, I want to tell you what I would call simplers or dudes maybe enter the council unlimit off
what's called Unitarian.
The interview.
Right. The category of sort of what's called Unitarian monotheism. There's one God and he's one person. These are categories of much later scholarship that get read back into things.
Honestly, just stop calling Christianity monotheism. Just stop. It's intellectually dishonest.
So the term monotheism is really coined actually in like the 16th century. And it's Greek words. I mean, monos and theos are Greek words. So the church fathers, for example, could have used that word. Greek-speaking Jews could have used that word, but they didn't. But what happens is later scholarship, as we get into the modern period, wants to sort of classify everything and come up with a taxonomy of everything. And one of those things is religion. So they say, well, we have these religions here that are monotheists, where they believe in one God, and these religions here that are polytheists, and then variations in between and around those. But those are sort of external imposed categories. And when you actually read the people who started using them, it's actually kind of horrifying in a lot of ways, because there's a lot of sort of the politics and pseudoscience of the time coming into that. So polytheism is always very primitive, right? And then monotheism is this advance. And then if you're a 19th century German Hegelian, then you do this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing where you have polytheism and then monotheism, and then the Trinity is like a synthesis. And eventually you arrive at 19th century German Protestantism, which is the pinnacle of all human religion, which was just totally objective on their part. When you go back and let the sources sort of speak for themselves, right, rather than me coming with my categories and trying to say, okay, which box am I going to put these people in, and you go to the writings in the Second Temple period, what you find is almost universally they saw there being at least two persons or hypostases, which becomes the later
hypostases, really
term used in the church, and is also used by modern scholars actually when talking about ancient divinities. But there were two persons of Yahweh at least. So sort of what you might call a binitarianism, minimally.
No, not a binitarianism. No.
And it was sort of hazy and shadowy to them how these two persons related to each other exactly, and who in particular. I mean, the first person, obviously, well, this is God, right? So that was simple. But then, who is this second person, and how does he relate to God? And how, if he came to be in that position, how did he come to be in that position? The father and son language is not a Christian innovation. That is fairly common in talking about these figures, but even that doesn't totally define it. So you have certain people who will see it as, well, this is some human who has been sort of divinized. So you'll find some sources, some Second Temple Jewish writings, where this is Adam or Abraham or Enoch who ascends into heaven, or David himself. In some of the sources that connect this person with the Messiah, they'll say, oh, well, this is David and he's going to come back, right? And then you have other sources where this is some kind of higher ranking angelic being sort of above the other angels. This is sort of the greatest angel. And you find other sources who are very close to what becomes Christian Orthodoxy, but this is just an eternal second person. And
I really want to know who these sources are, what he's talking about exactly. Because honestly, if now suddenly Philo and the Book of Enoch just...
Those discussions really continue into the Christian period. So the Christian heresies that quote unquote arise in the early centuries are really continuations of these modes of thought that were already there in Judaism. So Christianity is united even at the very beginning of saying Jesus of Nazareth is this person. But then you will find adoptionists who say, well, yes, Jesus of Nazareth was divinized into this person. Or you will find Arians who say, yes, Jesus of Nazareth is the incarnation of this angelic being, right? And then what becomes the Orthodox party. You also see already, though, threeness also sometimes in some of those sources. Philo is sort of exhibit A, Philo of Alexandria, who talks about these two figures of the Logos and wisdom. He has two. There are others, though, too, who have three persons within Yahweh. And this is something you can read more about in Jewish sources. So this is sort of the classic work on this is Alan Segel's Two Powers in Heaven, where he talks about the binitarian view and its universality, and then how it's sort of repudiated by Rabbinic Judaism in the 2nd century. It gives all of that history.
It wasn't just repudiated by Rabbinic Judaism in the 2nd century. It was repudiated by the Bible all through Judaism's history. The prophets were constantly saying that, no, stop stop this idolatry, right? And it was really funny listening. I was trying to see what the Christian answer is to why did God just, why didn't he teach the Trinity? Why was there this constant monotheistic railing by the prophets all through Judaism? Why have the Shema seem to be so clearly refuting Christianity, right? Why didn't God? And they were like, this was the actual answer was, well, polytheism used to be a problem, but when it stopped being a problem, then the Trinity could be trotted out, right? There no longer we no longer have polytheism, so now we can have a Trinity. But because paganism and polytheism was a problem before, and you see how this is an argument somebody may have made 200 or 300 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, whereas it's not something somebody can say today. And look at India, right? And of course, look at Christianity, polytheism.
Other works as well. Daniel Boyarin's Borderlines is really good on this. He's writing about the separation in the 2nd century of Judaism and Christianity. And he talks about how the word of God was seen as a person within Second Temple Judaism very commonly. So again, this is something you'll find more actually in Jewish scholarship than a lot of Christian scholarship, that tends to take this evolutionary view still, that sort of Christian theology started out very simple. They thought Jesus was just a man, and then they started thinking about it more and said, well, really, isn't he kind of divine? And then later still, they thought about it more and said, well, no, I think he was really divine. It sort of goes from there. If you look at those Jewish sources, they will say these ideas pre-existed. So what Christianity does is just identify Jesus of Nazareth as this person.
That's really interesting. And I'll say, if I remember, because I usually promise to link things in the description and then end up forgetting. But if I remember, I'll try to link those texts that you mentioned in the description, because I think people will really enjoy checking those out. And I think, the evolutionary view has had such sway in academic circles, but I think it makes sense when you look at this idea that, no, like they had these concepts already. If you're trying to make sense of the explosive growth of Christianity, which of course we don't want to do on just like a socio-historical level.
The explosive growth of Pauline Christianity within Gentiles. There apparently was a real growth of Christianity, of Jewish Christianity within Judaism in Jerusalem, right? So the Church of James, right, as in Acts, is claiming, look, we have thousands of people and there wasn't a problem. It was when Paul shows up with his heresy that causes the problems and causes the break between Judaism and what became to be thought as the teachings of Jesus. Say wasn't actually the teachings of Jesus, though.
But the fact that they'd have kind of this shelf space, if you will, for more than a singularity in the Godhead, it would make more sense that you could see Jews converting en masse to Christianity, and at least seeing
Jews converting en masse to Pauline Christianity. No, that's precisely what didn't happen.
Seeming like, oh, this could be a plausible thing. We have a category for this, even though it might be bending some of those categories and making new use of them. I'd love to ask, kind of stepping back there, with this like binitarian view, what are some of the main kind of texts that are sparking discussion on this? Because at some place in the Old Testament, you have some very strong statements of like, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, kind of like the Shema there, and different things. But then you do have some of these texts that you see, like I'm familiar with Christian reflection on these, but I'd love to know if they're the same text or maybe different texts that were sparking some of this thought and reflection among Jews of that time.
Yeah, I mean, the big central one, the one that a lot of this ends up revolving around in the Second Temple world, is in Daniel, the enthronement of the Son of Man with the Ancient of Days. And the fact that there are thrones plural set. Right? This becomes, the big focus. And so often the Son of Man is the name that's used when you read Second Temple sources for this.
So the Son of Man debate, honestly, I don't know if he's even describing, I mean, there's so much ink there. I certainly have not delved into it as much as I would like to, but his description doesn't seem like a complete description of the Son of Man debate, because from what I have seen, they're actually part of what was surprising is how little this word "Son of Man" is used in Second Temple texts, whereas we had expected, well, Christians had expected that it would actually show up a lot more.
Second person. So when you read First Enoch, sometimes just the Book of Enoch, it's the Son of Man who appears there, right? And who is the Book of Enoch or First Enoch is really a compilation of a bunch of texts and traditions regarding Enoch. But in some of the later ones, that figure is identified as the Messiah, right? The Son of Man is identified as the coming Messiah, and we see Christ himself talking about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, referring to himself as the Son of Man, identifying as that figure. The people he was talking to in the first century had a framework to understand that of fitting in there. And the reason I say that's so central is that that's the text that ends up getting.
Okay, so I had to look this up. Book of Enoch, so First Enoch. The older sections, mainly in the Book of the Watchers of the text, are estimated to date from about 300 to 200 BC, and the latest parts probably to 100 BC. Honestly, I think it's, yeah.
Addressed by rabbinic Judaism down the line. Once that's been sort of disavowed, they have to come back to that and say, well, okay, then what is this talking about? And the Talmud actually gives two different answers.
The Talmud, so he says that as if it's weird that the Talmud gives two different answers. There are almost, so I actually fall into this as well, is saying the Talmud says, because we're used to texts which are actually have a unified explanation of things, and when most people, when you say the Talmud says, what you're saying is there was an opinion given in the Talmud, and either nobody disagreed with it, or that it somehow is a subtext of the broader disagreement that there are. But generally, any question that the Talmud asks, there's at least two answers. And yeah, this is strange to Christians, but I mean, what's he laughing at? The Talmud gives two answers. Yeah, this is news.
So you can see there was still thought going on even at that period, right? That you
So if I were better at clipping things, like, you can still see that there was thought going on. I would hope you could say that about Judaism still to today, and I personally wouldn't say the opposite about Christianity too loudly. I, I would hope there's still thought going on in Christianity.
have these two different answers from two different perspectives. One of them in Tractate Hagiga is aimed at Rabbi Akiva, because it was sort of well known even by that time that Rabbi Akiva, at the end of the first and beginning of the second century, had believed in two powers in heaven. He had held to this. And so they insert this story where
I really want to look this up. I'm not particularly aware of it, but the idea that that rabbis see, this is where Christianity just completely misunderstands Judaism, which is Judaism is warts and all, and you can see that in our Bible especially, and Christianity really doesn't seem to understand that.
he sort of corrected on it, where they say, "Oh no, he figured out that was wrong," right? And what is asserted there is that the two thrones and the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man are sort of two manifestations of the one God. So sort of what we would call modalism in Christian circles. That one of these is for mercy and one of these is for justice, right? And so it's just sort of different ways God appears. And then they read that.
So this is how Christians end up saying that, in the Kabbalah there are 10 gods, right? Because, again, like I said before, the idea that God manifests himself in different ways is not non-controversial in Judaism. the idea that any of these manifestations are God, right? Um, in the sense that Christians use that idea is just a mistranslation, and I think he, I, I don't even know if it's his misunderstanding of it, or he's allowing people to misunderstand things that he himself would repudiate. Part of my whole thing is I kind of wonder if I were to speak to him, if I would have a similar experience to what Rationality Rules had when talking to Jonathan Pajot, and say, well, of course you don't believe this, and have him say, oh, yes, I do. Right? um, I really don't know.
Back. So, for example, in some of the Exodus passages where you see the angel of the Lord and Yahweh, right? Or there's a text in Exodus that says that Yahweh is a man of war, and that gives.
This actually gets me really mad. The words ish milchama. I don't understand how somebody who knows Hebrew, as I believe Father Stephen does, can even entertain this argument. Right? Um, it's no, it's just so bad. I don't even know what to say about it. Right?
Modern people a lot of problems because we don't like the violence of the Old Testament, which is the subject of my next book. But but the problem that ancient Judaism had with it was it says Yahweh is a man.
No, that's ish milchama. Come on, no, just stop. And part of the reason why I keep on emphasizing the necessity for people to learn Hebrew themselves is, um, we have this propensity of having this discussion in English, wanting to find people who understand Hebrew how we want, and cherry picking scholars, as opposed to, if you actually learn Hebrew and you actually engage with these ideas, you're I think far smaller numbers of people would find them, you know, this this text referring to God as Ish Milchama is in the daily prayers. It's in the daily prayers. I mean, what? Please. It's not something we're shying away from. It's your misunderstanding which we find repulsive.
So they were like, wait, right? What is that about? And so they read that back in. They say, oh, well, see, this is this younger appearance, the Son of Man. This is for justice and war, right? When he appears to go into battle and issue judgment. And then this the Ancient of Days, the old man appearance is for when he's showing mercy. Um, so there's that. And then the other answer in the Talmud is there's another story about another rabbi who gets corrected on it, where he has this heavenly vision and he sees this angel who is sitting down in heaven. And in the ancient world, sitting down was a sign of authority. And so the angel is taken and beaten, like whipped by the other angels for having given him the wrong impression. And he's sort of exiled and cast out for having held to this heresy. But you can see they're still trying to think through what to do with that. There are other passages. I mean, some of the famous ones that they're trying to deal with in the Old Testament are especially the angel of the Lord figure. But then, for example, at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where it says that Yahweh, who's standing there talking to Abraham, calls down fire from Yahweh in heaven.
Okay, so this, I would say the two things in the Hebrew language which cause basically all of the Christian misunderstanding: the direct object marker, which only exists in Hebrew and a few other languages, does not exist in English, and construct chains, which are a uniquely Semitic, although I believe Chinese does similar things. Don't quote me on that. But this capacity of putting words together to form some bigger, and I kind of wonder if German doesn't kind of do that as well. But that is what those two things, certainly when translating from the Hebrew to English, or those two things cause a lot of problems. And this idea that it was me'et havaya, right? No.
Everybody step back and say, well, wait a second, right? So all of these are being dealt with because everyone is reading these things very closely. And they're reading those earlier texts like the Torah through the lens of texts like Daniel that have this Son of Man passage and a heavenly man who appears and speaks to Daniel and trying to understand what's going on there.
That's wonderful. So much to think about there. And I love that we can see them working through these questions actively and even kind of painting things back onto things, or like the whipping of the angel is such an interesting way of kind of reworking stories and kind of showing how the theology is developing. And again, perhaps in reaction here, in opposition to Christianity, trying to say, yeah, like we see this in the tradition, but this is wrong. We've come to that conclusion. So we have to figure out how to show that in a compelling way. Very interesting stuff. Something that your book kind of leads to throughout, again, is this relationship between Judaism and Christianity, or Orthodox Christianity specifically. And is it continuity, rupture? How do those things work? And you come at it in, I think it's like the first chapter, in a really interesting way, talking about Paul. And you ask, Paul,
Hi, I'm so sorry, but I joined up late, and I still don't understand who the gentleman with the beard is and who he represents. Father Stephen DeYoung is the father. Is the person with the beard. He is an Eastern Orthodox priest and scholar, and he I mean, I think I would say he's a representative of the Paul within Judaism school of thought, which most people would more identify with N.T. Wright, which is this idea of re-understanding Paul of Tarsus as not being a convert to Christianity, but rather a leader within Judaism into Christianity. Fake name, I don't remember the story about the rabbi and the angel. I'm not sure who you are. Am I not recognizing you from some other place? If you're on my server, let me know. Maybe we were talking on Discord, or sorry.
Question mark, I think, is how it's put out there. And to many, like, that's like the quintessential thing of Paul. Like, yes, Paul is the convert from Judaism. Like, that is adjective number one for Paul, perhaps. Missionary convert, we'll put those in there somewhere. So, like, they might almost be surprised to even hear that question. Why would we ask if Paul was a convert? Isn't that what, like, every Wikipedia article on him would say? However, you outline a bit of how you understand Paul and the apostles' self-understanding of the relationship between their commitment to Jesus and their Judaism. Now, this is always difficult, but if we could get into the mind of Paul, what is it that you're seeing there? How would he see himself and the relationship between those things?
Right, and we really have to go by how, right, St. Paul describes himself, how he describes himself in his own experience. That's the closest we can get to getting into his mind. But yeah, we take that for granted, and that comes from, St. Augustine, when he reads about St. Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, he identifies with it very much. And there's nothing invalid about him identifying with it, but that shapes how he reads it, right? And so he was very much a convert from Manichaeism and Platonism to Christianity. And Martin Luther does the same thing, right? He very much identifies with what happens with St. Paul in his own experience. But then because of that, his own experience shapes how he reads it. And in the West, if you're doing any kind of Western Christian theology, you're an heir to St. Augustine and or Martin Luther, right? That's maybe both, maybe one or the other. And so that shaped how it's read. But if we really go back and think about it, in 35 AD, when this happened, there weren't these two separate religions, Judaism and Christianity, where you could leave one and go to the other, right? They don't exist as entities. They aren't separate communities yet. That's not going to happen for another 120 years. So we're reading back in when we approach it that way. What St. Paul talks about when he talks about it, and we have in the book of Acts, we have St. Luke's narration of it sort of as it happens. We have at the end of the book of Acts, St. Paul in a speech going back and talking about it. And then he himself talks about it later in Galatians. And the language he uses there.
Oh, hey, controller. Okay. There goes and then Angel City. I'll have to take a look at it again. Thanks so much for your answer, and I understand why he thinks like that. Yeah.
Is drawn directly from Jeremiah. And he talks about being called from his mother's womb to be the apostle to the Gentiles, the apostle to the nations. And that's the exact same language that's used, especially if you compare the Greek of the prophet Jeremiah's call, that he was called from his mother's womb to be a prophet to the nations, to the Gentiles. And as you look at the event of the vision that St. Paul has on the road to Damascus, and you put it in line with the Old Testament paradigm, you see that what this is comparable to is Isaiah is called to be a prophet where he sees the Lord high and lifted up, right, in the temple, and Ezekiel is called to be a prophet where he sees sort of the throne chariot of God. This is the natural way St. Paul, as a very faithful and very pious Jew at this time, would have interpreted his experience, right? And we see him doing that in his own words, lining it up with those prophetic calls of the Old Testament. And so the Messiah coming was not sort of a surprise, right, to them. There's sort of this unspoken presupposition in the way that we look at the beginnings of Christianity, that they sort of had this one religious belief and this one expectation. And then when Christ comes, it's so radically different that they have to just sort of scrap all of that and start over.
Okay, so this is what PVK always says, right? That people were expecting one thing and something else happened. So this is the crux of the discussion and the disagreement here, right? So the problem with PVK's way of looking at it is he's thinking, okay, all these Jews misunderstood, and Jesus comes and redefines the meaning of the word Messiah. Well, if that's the case, how did they get the wrong idea, and why wasn't this definition the one that God always had, right? So now Father DeYoung is trying to rework that, and he's like, oh, no. So what Jesus is the Messiah was always there, right? And so this is a whole different argument, and these two arguments are contradictory with each other. And yeah, I mean, honestly, again, going back to what Bo said, the problem is that Christianity is incoherent.
But you don't get that from reading the New Testament. The New Testament is continuously filled with quotations of the Old Testament saying, no, this is fulfilled. This is now the realization. This is now the fullness of that. There's not this disassociation. And so St. Paul, when he set out for Damascus, was expecting a Messiah to come. The reason we get so many would-be Messiahs in the first century is that based on their reading of Daniel, they figured that was the rough time.
No. So this idea that the calculation is the reason is just plain wrong. Judaism believes in the coming of the Messiah. We have for thousands of years, and that's how our religion is constantly looking forward to the coming of the Messiah.
Period, based on the weeks in Daniel. So they were expecting it to happen soon. And he expected that when the Messiah came, he would establish this new age would begin, this messianic age. And then at the end of that messianic age, the end would come. So when it's revealed to him very directly and very powerfully that Jesus, who he had been persecuting, is the Messiah, is the Christ, he doesn't start a new religion or scrap everything and start over. He isn't like, oh, everything I knew was wrong. He says, okay, well, we need
I disagree. He actually does start a new religion.
to adjust the timetable, right? This means the messianic age has begun. And him coming to me means I now have this job in relation to that messianic age. And having read the prophets thoroughly, he knew that one of the things that was going to happen in that messianic age was that all of the nations were going to come flooding to Jerusalem to come and worship the God of Israel. And so he sees himself as the agent of that. So the broad worldview, the broad picture, the broad timeline stay basically.
So in a sense, he's kind of talking preterism, but not
the same for St. Paul. He just realized he had moved from one part of that to another once he knew who the Messiah was.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I want to anticipate one question that I think people might have, and you've hinted at it a bit in talking about in the 2nd century, there is this rupture that happens between Christians and Jews. We see some conflict there. There's still dialogue, but we start to see theology kind of becoming, I guess, I don't want to use this too strongly, but like polemical in a sense between one another. And I could see people saying, maybe having some knowledge of that, or just hearing you say that and saying, well, if this is, primarily in continuity, but with a shift in the timetables and, saying that Jesus is in fact this Messiah that we all have been hoping for, he is the one, that they're using these Jewish categories, why do we see such a conflict arising?
Right. Well, and there are consequences for identifying this particular person, Jesus of Nazareth, as the Messiah.
Again, look at Acts 5, look at Acts 15, look at Acts 21. He's spinning a completely different narrative now. And there's a reason why he has to.
And it's hard to make a broad claim. It's like today, 100 people hear the gospel, and different people receive it different ways. It's saying, well, wait, why did the gospel take root here and not there? Or why did, a lot of that is the Holy Spirit, and we don't know exactly. But because there was this diversity within Judaism at the time that Christ is born, and there are all kinds of different relationships going on there, and not just spiritually. I mean, it's not just a question of religious belief. There are power relationships and political things going on. The Roman persecution, from which Judaism had a certain amount of exemption, most of the time, not all the time, and which Christianity didn't necessarily share. There are all kinds of other relationships going on here that influence people and why things happen.
He's definitely right about all of this. I think he's not talking enough about the diversity within Christianity and the split between Pauline Christianity and Jewish Christianity.
But you see, for example, that the primary group that becomes rabbinic Judaism is the Pharisees. That's why they're so central in both the New Testament texts and following on. Is that the Sadducees became less of a concern, right, once the temple is destroyed, and the nascent Christian community wasn't facing a lot of opposition from Egyptian Jewish sects or Ethiopian Jews who had a more apocalyptic framework. They weren't the ones who were in the direct conflict. And so I think we see in the New Testament texts themselves the beginning of this conflict between the party of the Pharisees and Christ himself. And then
what he's identifying as the party of Pharisees, I would say, is actually Pharisaic Christian. And he's kind of erasing these Christians from he's moving them outside of Christianity into Judaism and making them foils for the rest of Judaism, whereas I think the picture that Acts 5 is painting is no, we have broader Pharisaic Judaism, right, which was the most populous and was what I believe Christianity was part of, right? And the Pharisees had some Christians within them, and like Gamliel says, okay, if they last, they last, right? We have, let God deal with that. And then there were the Pauline Christians, right? And their conflict was with the Christians who were Pharisaic, who were within Judaism, and eventually, like Rabban Gamliel predicted, it was impossible for the Jews who were Christian to withstand and what actually ended up happening to them. I mean, there's a whole thing, but what exactly happened to those Jewish Christians? How did they disappear? Where are they? Robert Eisenman would say that they are actually represented in modern day by Islam.
If you read Acts closely, when Acts 15 and the Council of Jerusalem happens, the problem is instigated by a group of Christians, but Christians who had come from the party of the Pharisees. And so there were certain viewpoints within the broader Judaisms of the time that were more or less compatible, right? The perspectives and the framework that was adopted by Christianity, that continued into Christianity, had already been rejected by a lot of those Jewish groups, as not. And so when that becomes Christianity, when those groups say, well, this is the Messiah, it's actually going to be more natural for those other groups that were at odds with them to say, well, no, he's not, right? than to even really consider it. So I think there's a lot of dynamics going on there, but I think that's one of them, is that Christianity is this continuity, but it's a continuity with particular elements and particular groups and particular viewpoints within Second Temple Judaism. And that diversity that was already there continues.
Which again highlights this dynamic, this important framework of Judaisms, not just a monolithic Judaism. And if there's already conflict and it aligns with one side, I think that's a great way of putting it, that, well, it's natural that that's going to be rejected because you already have this tension there. And of course, as you mentioned before, there's a lot of mystery and the element of the role of the Holy Spirit in essentially, how the seed lands, where the gospel takes root and where it doesn't. I want to make sure in this conversation to avoid something that I think you make sure to avoid in your book. So far we've been talking mainly about the belief of these people, which I think is really important. But at the very beginning of this whole conversation, you mentioned that today in the West, we tend to have like a truncated sense of what religion is. And that it's like just this one kind of siloed thing, maybe a series of like a systematic theology, like Wayne Grudem, that's religion right there. But there's more to it than that. And you highlight in your book aspects of ritual and, well, I guess scholars would call it cultic practice, although that might throw people off using that word. But I think where this gets us is, so not only is there an amount of continuity in the beliefs, but you highlight also kind of this continuity in the spiritual practices, if you will, for lack of a better word. Could you speak about some of that?
Yeah, we very much as modern people segment these things, right? So we talk about, there's politics over here, and then religion, and then economics, and even within our own personal lives, there's sort of, well, here's my work life, and here's my family life, and here's my church life, and right, as these sort of separate spheres. And that didn't really exist in the ancient world. In the ancient world, everything is all permeated, and
It still doesn't exist within Islam and Judaism. I think this is a uniquely Christian way of separating your religion from your actions, which came out of Pauline antinomianism.
is together, right? So when you have people worshiping Caesar as a god, you can't separate politics and religion, right? Like those are going to naturally combine. You can't be apolitical. We're talking about religion. So when those are blended together, we have to see Christianity as less a religion, as sort of this ancillary thing that you either do or do not have in your life, and see Christianity more as a way of living in the world. And so it encompasses all of that. The way I am with my family is part of being a Christian. The way I am in my work, the way I am in my hobbies, the way I am at church, all of that is part of being a Christian in all of those spheres. And so because of that, because it sort of encompassed all of life, it's sort of natural, and you see this in Second Temple Judaism, you see this in early Christianity, the birth of a child, weddings, funerals, right? All of these things, all these aspects of life are all deeply religious and deeply involved. The way we begin the day with prayer and end the day with prayer, the way we eat our food and what we eat right, on any given day. This is all involved in this Christian way of living, and it's all disciplined and ordered and structured by God. And part of, and this is really sort of the last section of the book, I get into this a lot, part of what I think is a misunderstanding of the role of the Torah or the law by a lot of contemporary Christians is that we've not only said, well, yeah, we don't follow the food laws, we don't follow the, so we can just kind of ignore all that stuff, is that it's not just ignoring those specific things, but sometimes it's just, well, now it doesn't matter what I eat and what I do and how I do these, that not like an antinomianism where you say there's no sin, right? But in terms of the conduct of our daily lives, we tend to look at a lot of these things as just sort of neutral. They're sort of secular and neutral and not directly connected to our faith and to our life as Christians. But that's not something that there was no neutral ground in the ancient world, right? Something was either claimed by Christ or it remained in this world that's under the domination of evil, of the demonic powers. So everything needed to be sanctified and brought to Christ and blessed and made holy in every aspect of our lives. And that was done primarily, as you mentioned, ritually. And that's why there were all these rituals connected with childbirth and then bringing the child into the church and marriages and funerals and the Eucharist on this regular basis, which is, after all, eating, right? And in continuity with the sacrificial system, as I argue in the book, and that this is a daily thing where all of these things are made holy, and those structures then make us holy as we practice them and pursue them.
Yeah, there's so much there. And as you were saying that, I just had the thought of, if there isn't yet a book called The Myth of Neutrality that gets at this idea of the Christian way of kind of breaking that down, there needs to be. So maybe your book after the one on divine violence can be on that. I'll buy it. But no, there's so much there. And I could chase so many rabbit trails, but I think maybe one of the most profitable would be to talk about this idea, and this is maybe showing myself a little bit here, the circles I grew up in, which were evangelical circles through and through, that like to talk about the early church in kind of this broad brush way that generally seemed to have an uncanny resemblance to whatever it was that we were doing. It was kind of, a way of painting back onto it. And you mentioned in, I think it's like the prologue or the preface to your book, that we tend to think of the early church as this like house church movement that didn't have a lot of structure, that kind of was a breakaway from ritual. I remember even listening to a popular worship song that says like, break down the walls of all my religion, tear down the walls of all my traditions, or something like that. Like, that's what Christianity is, right? Didn't it move away from ritual and religion? And you show in your book that that's not quite the case. How is it that you think we've come to that understanding, and what can we do to kind of see the early church as it was?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there are very telling things when we read the scriptures closely. Like at the beginning of the book of Acts, we have the early Christian community continuing to go and pray at the temple. Now they're not going and participating in sin offerings, right?
Hold on there, because what Acts 21 is describing is the Nazirite vow, which includes a sin offering.
And that kind of thing. But they are going to the temple to pray. And the language that's used there, for example, is that they continued at the prayers. Not just they prayed, but the prayer, that there were times of prayer, and they continued to pray at those times. In 1 Corinthians, St. Paul argues sort of very directly.
Do you have a website? I would like to mail you a book to eventually get your opinions on it. My website is for my business. My address is on there. I mean, if people want to send me books, I don't know if I'll get a chance to read it. You certainly can. But the website I have is just my last name, federacci.com, and it's for my insurance business. So if you need insurance, feel free to buy it on the website. Yeah, I don't have a website as far as all this.
When he's talking about the Eucharist and what's going on there, his comparisons are to the altar at the temple, right? Is not what is offered there a participation, right, in the God of Israel. And he compares it to pagan sacrifices and says what they offer to demons. I don't want you to be partakers of demons. And says in the Eucharist, we're partaking of Christ, right? So he's continuing to, obviously there's something that is shifted there, something very important, right, in the sacrifice of Christ and how the Eucharist works. But it's still within this continuity. It's not now we've scrapped one and this is a whole different thing where we're starting from scratch. We see that again and again with all of these detailed things. I think I try to be very charitable to the Protestant reformers, because I think they legitimately were trying to, as best they could, get back past a lot of the medieval Western accretions that had shown up in 16th century Roman Catholicism, right? Which even the Roman Catholic Church today would admit to, right? Because they had a Counter-Reformation, right? There were things that they saw and they rolled back, but they didn't have the data to do it, right? So Luther and Calvin were actually themselves were very conscientious about trying to go back to the church fathers, at least the ones they had, and the ones they knew were legitimate, because there were also all kinds of false writings going around at that time in history, to try to get back to what that was like. And you find them, for example, making statements that they fully believed were true and were based on the best evidence they had, like John Calvin at one point saying, well, there were no icons before the 6th century in churches. Well, we just know that's not true now. Archaeologically, we know it's just actually not true. But he was doing the best that he could. And so I think that the modern American evangelical view, I don't think it's necessarily a capitulation to this evolutionary view of the church, although that's there as a subtext, that the church started over and therefore started very simply and became more complex over time. And we want to get back past that complexity to the simple original. I think it's a continuation of Calvin and Luther's impulse in modern evangelical Christianity. But part of what I'm doing in the book, at least on the apologetic level for evangelical and other Protestant readers, is to say, well, we have a lot more information available to us today than Luther and Calvin did about what the early church was like. Archaeological evidence of ancient churches, Second Temple Jewish writings, thanks to Qumran and thanks to translations. We have all of this information now available to us. Even if you follow out that instinct, I'm arguing in the book, this may be the central argument of the book, is that if you follow out that instinct with all of the information we have available today, you arrive at something that looks very much like what the Orthodox Church is doing. Maybe not identical in every detail, but very much in continuity with, and very much in that vein.
Yes, and you work that case very well, and it leads exactly where I wanted to go with the next question. And before I do that, I want to say I do appreciate the charity given to the reformers, and I think we do have to recognize that we are at such.
John Calvin was a murderer. If I yeah, I think we should be much less charitable to John Calvin and Martin Luther.
Such a privileged place today to have such a wealth of information. I mean, I've got Logos on my computer. I pull it up and can search however many things I want. And that simply wasn't a reality for people working in the 16th century or at different times. Even though we're further removed from some of these times, we do have certain privileges. And anyway, I just want to say I appreciate the charitable view towards that. But where I wanted to go is this kind of question, which I initially, when I first sent you the outline, so sorry if you thought I was going to skip this question, was further up. But I think it's really kind of where this is all leading is the relationship between Orthodox Christianity and the religion of the apostles. Cleverly, the title of your book. And also Second Temple Judaism. So, I mean, I guess I'll ask these questions separately, though maybe they don't need to be separate. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here in a lot of ways, is if you took a second temple Jew from the first century and you brought them to, was it St. Gabriel Archangel Orthodox Church in Lafayette, or the local Jewish synagogue, obviously, this is just a thought experiment. There's so many things that would be unfamiliar to them, but where do they feel more at home? And I guess the second question would be,
okay, he doesn't answer where would they feel more at home. He answers the question he would prefer to be asked, which is, where would they recognize more things?
if you took one of the apostles, obviously they're going to, well, actually, I'm going to amend the second question. So let's just work with the first one.
Okay. Right. So if you went to an Orthodox Jewish synagogue today, and then you went to an Orthodox Divine Liturgy on a Sunday morning or on a feast day, you would notice that the first part of the Orthodox liturgy and the Orthodox synagogue service are very closely parallel to each other. Now, there would be certain differences. For example, in the Orthodox synagogue, you would have a procession with the Torah scroll, and in the first part of the Orthodox Divine Liturgy, you would have a procession with the Gospel book, right, held high.
And the Jew from the second century would recognize the procession with the Torah scroll, not the book.
You would see these parallels because what has historically happened was that what we see with the early Christians before this.
John Calvin was kinder and gentler. Rather than have Severus painfully die burned at the stake, Calvin said he only deserved beheading. I'm not sure that's much kinder and gentler. And frankly, since he very obviously wanted Severus dead. And I think that should tell you everything that you need to know about John Calvin. And personally, for me, the idea that, okay, sarcasm. Personally, for me, the idea that Servetus was a doctor whose discoveries were suppressed by the reformers, that counts for something.
Split. We see this in the Book of Acts, amongst other places, is that on the Sabbath they would go to the synagogue because again they haven't left Judaism. Right, this is still for them the same faith. They would go there, and there they would have the singing of psalms, the reading of the scriptures, some kind of homiletic, some kind of sharing preaching that was done different ways in different places in the ancient world. Whether you'd have one person like a rabbi expositing, or whether you'd have visitors or multiple people, right? And then on the Lord's Day, on the following day, they would gather for the Eucharist, for that.
So I actually think the Eucharist is probably more of the home aspects of it. He seems to. So there was the synagogue service, which existed during the Second Temple period. There were home aspects of Judaism, which existed during the Second Temple period. And there were things that were at the temple, right? And the mainstream Jewish, the Pharisaic, what maintained to be the Jewish ways, was to continue to have home things like Kiddush at home, to continue to have the synagogue services that were set up by the prophets during the destruction of the first temple, before the construction of the second temple. And our idea was within Judaism, okay, we were taught by the prophets how to act in relation to not having a temple during that intertemple period, and that's what we go back to. Whereas Christianity was like, no, well, first of all, so many of the, I mean, we're talking about Pauline Christianity, which they were Gentiles, they were misunderstanding so much uh, because it was not their culture. They were importing so many things from their own culture. And they had decided that they needed, that somehow Christianity was fulfilled by the destruction of the Second Temple, and that the churches became temples. And this is what a lot of people, even within Judaism, don't understand the difference between Orthodox Judaism and Reform, which, you know, now there are synagogues that are called temples, right? And that's within the Reform movement, which kind of gave up on the idea, especially 150, 200 years ago, gave up on the idea of a rebuilt actual temple, like Orthodox Jews believe. And I mean, so much of this theology has had to respond to the facts of um, the past 50, 60 years with the return of Jews to the land of Israel. And I mean, that's a huge other thing to talk about.
That ritual action. And so then what happens when the Christians are expelled from the synagogue in the mid-second century is that they take that synagogue part of the service and they bring it over onto the Lord's Day as well. And those two then are put together. And we now call that the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the sacrament, but really it's those two pieces. And so I would argue that the Second Temple Jewish person, and again, levels of familiarity would also depend, as we talked about, the diversity, where they're from, right? But they would, I think, recognize the same things going on in the first part of the liturgy and in the Orthodox synagogue service. And then I think when it got in the Orthodox liturgy,
And it depends whether or not they knew Hebrew. I mean, certainly the fact that the Orthodox liturgy is in the vernacular as opposed to being in the Hebrew is big. And part of the revulsion and reaction of Judaism was going even more into the Hebrew, right? Which is, no, you're missing something important by not knowing the Hebrew.
to the second part, they would recognize things from the structures of temple worship and sacrificial worship. And again, there would be some discontinuities, right? And you'd have to explain who Jesus was, for example, right? We keep talking about that he was the Messiah. But they would, I mean, even if they didn't understand the language at all, right? They would say, okay, they're now offering, from their perspective, bread and wine to God. This is their, right, their sacrificial ritual. And
the Kiddush is not a sacrificial ritual, really. I mean, yeah, that's the thing. I think a lot of Christianity simply could not internalize the things that were part of Jewish home life because they were part of Jewish home life.
Depending on where they were from in the Second Temple Jewish world, they might or might not think it was weird that we weren't in Jerusalem. So you have, the temple in Elephantine, and
So this idea that there was a temple at Elephantine in Egypt. Question is, how long did it exist? Did it actually exist up unto the time of Jesus? I don't. I actually. I mean, I don't know. But the he's making it sound like it was normal to have temples outside of Jerusalem, and it's like, no, it really wasn't.
Egypt, you have other places where in Qumran they weren't actually offering sacrifices, but they had reconstructed a lot of the temple worship there. So someone from Qumran might identify that immediately. Oh, they're doing what we did, and they're doing sort of the temple worship here. So yeah, I think it's not as simple as which one would they recognize more, but they would recognize what's going on in the divine liturgy, and see that something has happened, and that would be the place where you'd have to preach the gospel to them and say, well, yeah, here's why now there's this shift, because the Messiah came, he's Jesus of Nazareth. Right?
I appreciate you playing along with that thought experiment. I know they're always, by nature, they're difficult. And I think you parsed that out really well, and that there's enough points of continuity for them to have kind of an understanding of what's going on. But obviously, there's also things that are different, which would require some bringing up to speed. But even those things, they wouldn't be so categorically strange that they wouldn't even have some type of shelf space for it. I appreciate that. The second thing I want to ask, and it's something, I believe it's towards the end of your book that you get to some of these things that I don't know why you put them here, but perhaps as you're kind of mounting a collective case, especially to maybe Protestants or evangelicals, these are things that might seem a little more strange. And so kind of the second thought experiment is like you take one of the apostles and you bring them to your local house church that's trying to just like be faithful to the Bible, like their sola scriptura, kind of maybe like an Anabaptist vibe, meeting in houses, trying to be the original church. And you take them to an Orthodox church where they might hear about this term Theotokos, and they have like this formal priesthood. Versus, it's just everyone gathering in homes, breaking bread. Maybe not even like in a Eucharistic way. Maybe they're literally breaking bread. Why would they not be terrified? Because I think the people at the Anabaptist house church would think the apostles would be terrified to see this formal priesthood and this mention of the Theotokos, these things that we think of as very late things oftentimes. Does that make sense? That was a long question.
Yeah. I think the quick answer is I think when they went to the house church, they would think, oh, these must be like persecuted Christians or something who don't have a church to go to. And so they were they're worshiping in their home.
The entirety of Judaism was being persecuted by the Romans during the Second Temple period, and then, yeah, the early Christians were persecuted. This is part of the problem that both Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism have, which is they became state religions, and that shaped them, and that they still think of themselves in many ways as these reigning religions. And part of why I think Judaism needed to remain what it was, and part of why it was necessary to have Christianity and Islam spread the ideas of Judaism without actual Judaism spreading around the world, is that Judaism has always seen itself as a priesthood, and as a small priesthood that was voluntary, right? Judaism does not look forward to a Messiah who's going to make all the rest of the world our slaves. Um, Judaism looks forward to a world in which every knee shall bow, but in a willing way, and not in terms of stopping being who they are. And I think actually Roman Catholicism might have actually integrated that a little bit better, especially over the past 100 years or so. This concept of allowing people to be who they are and ministering to them, which, I mean, Israel is the original nation of priests. It is a priesthood. Yeah. Do you think the meaning crisis is really only a Christian thing because they appropriated something and have it baked? I certainly don't see the meaning crisis within Orthodox Judaism. I certainly see a lot of the meaning crisis expressing itself in liberal reform and conservative Judaism. Conservative is part of liberal Judaism. Um, and honestly, I mean, I have to say, I think actually committed Christianity would doesn't also isn't having nearly as much of the meaning crisis think part of the problem of the unraveling of Christianity is all of these questions that we're talking about. Unfortunately, Christianity is incoherent, and when a thinking person seriously uh, asks the questions that we've been asking and wrestles with what we've been wrestling with, you end up with a deconstruction. Um, I wish the Noahide movement was more healthy than it is. Hopefully, it will eventually blossom into something much healthier than it is right now. Right now, there's a lot of bitter Christians there, and most of the healthy people are, or at least their children, are converting to Judaism and becoming part of the Jewish community. And ultimately, you know, Judaism's going to have to deal with welcoming all of the people who end up seeing the problems of Christianity back into Judaism. Yes, I am still wrestling with Jesus' question, who do you say I am? Uh, you're not the only one. Certainly, that's a question on our server, on my server, most of all. Um, I would say the most important thing to say is precisely what Gamliel did, which is it doesn't matter. It's not about human beings. It's about God. Stupid question. Sorry, there are stupid questions. I am not thinking this is one of them. But where do we place faith, pure and sincere faith in both religions? Ooh, you ask the simple ones. Honestly, I wouldn't even be able to begin to answer that right now. That's oof, a whole thing. Um, yeah, ask. You might want to come on the Discord server and we can discuss that. It's not a simple thing to address at all.
Whereas I think they would.
I do think it's really important to say that the people who believe in God need to be unapologetically theistic, and we need a resurgence of theism and active theism.
Would look at something like liturgy, and that would be more in the vein of the kind of worship that they were used to, right? That they were used to experiencing. But in terms of those particular things that might be suspected would be just bizarro world. I mean, again, there would be, if we're talking about one of the apostles, okay, who has received Christianity. For example, they would understand that Theotokos means the one who gave birth to God, because they know Greek. So they would say, oh, right, Mary, the Lord's mother.
I am not on Reddit, Ricardo. Sorry. I'm mostly on Discord. I will put a link to the Discord server in the chat. One thing I do want to say about his whole thing with the Gevira and the Theotokos. Oi, where these Christians got this idea of a Gevira, like, I was floored by it. The idea that there was a specific queen mother position is something they got very um you're certainly not going to see that in any secular history at all. I don't think. Yeah, that's just um you can look at the you can look at the Bible verses they claim to prove this Gevira. I certainly did. Um, Honestly, I think this is the exact same problem we have with the Hebrew word Adon, right? Lord, and this Christian idea that somehow it was understood by Jews that Jesus was some sort of divine figure by calling him Lord. If you go to Israel, you will refer to the cab driver as Adoni, my Lord. And you will refer to the woman walking down the street as Giveret. So this idea that, yeah, I just wish people spoke Hebrew more, learned Hebrew, and then we wouldn't have these discussions nearly as often.
And in terms of us mentioning them, I make the argument that they wouldn't think that was that weird because it was already going back into the Old Testament. One of the things that we see in the Old Testament when we read closely the books of Samuel and Kings, and particularly here in the book of Kings, once we get past David to Solomon and his successors. Once we get into the bad kings, it's easy to start skimming, because it's just sort of like, then this guy became king. He was evil, right? He was so many years old that he died, and he was wicked. But when you go through the kings of Judah in particular, as opposed to the northern kingdom of Israel, every time a new king comes to the throne in the Davidic line, it gives the name of his mother. And the reason for that is that there's this institution established by Solomon with his mother, Bathsheba of all people, where he has this throne set at his right hand. And the queen mother, it's the Gebirah in Hebrew, becomes sort of his chief advisor. And so we see later on in the books of Kings that this role actually has a certain amount of authority within the administration, especially when Athaliah later, who's one of Ahab's family members, gets that role and uses it to try to exterminate the line of David. Is wicked. You see sort of the power that it held. But so the announcement of the new king was accompanied with, here's the name of his mother. And so the Messiah being by definition the Davidic king, the culmination of the line of David, you would expect a proclamation of his mother. And a piece of proof we have that happened, that I point out in the book, is that Celsus, depending on who taught you how to pronounce Latin, in the 2nd century is one of the sort of probably the greatest ancient pagan critic of Christianity. He writes this sort of quote unquote refutation of Christianity. And we know how powerful it was because everybody in the 2nd and 3rd centuries sort of responds to it from the Christian perspective. They take it seriously. And one of the attacks that he made was on the Virgin Mary, saying, well, she's just this peasant woman. She's not fit to be the mother of a king. Well, this is a period in history where Celsus couldn't go to his local church and sit there in the worship service, right? And there wasn't a Bible he could go and pick up and read right, in one place. So all he knew about Christianity was what was in the public proclamation. So that tells us, for him to know that and be able to make that attack, the fact that this woman, the Virgin Mary, is the mother of the Messiah, had to be part of that public proclamation. So I think that any apostle we picked would have a framework for understanding why we were mentioning the Theotokos. And then something similar with, in terms of the priesthood, it's really the presbyterate. My title is actually presbyter. The English word priest is actually derived from it etymologically. But this is, when you look at the way in which the ecclesia, the assembly of Israel, was structured in the Old Covenant, what you see in the New Testament is just that structure is brought over, right? So you have 70 elders. That institution becomes the Sanhedrin by the time we get to the New Testament. But then we have Christ appointing the 70. And then we have these these elders within the Christian communities. When St. Paul goes to Ephesus, he appoints the elders there. He tells St. Timothy, wherever you go, appoint presbyters, right? Appoint elders, and there are overseers. So these structures are inherited from the Old Covenant community. They're certainly transformed, right, as we come into the New Testament with the revelation of Christ. But then they're continued. So it's not that they begin with this structureless chaos, right? Everything we read in St. Paul's epistles is the opposite of that. Everything needs to be done decently and in good order, and we have leadership, and you support that leadership and follow that leadership, right? So we see these things in the pages of the New Testament. So again, I think while the robes might look a little different than what they're used to, I think any apostle who you brought in would say, oh, well, so okay, these are the presbyters, right? And these are the deacons, right? They do what deacons were, they appointed them themselves, and say, okay, that's how this community is functioning. So I think there were frames for all of these things. And again, now that we have this information available to us, we can see just how far back these things go, even pre the birth of Christ. These structures were already in place, and the apostles don't scrap them and start over, but they transform them. They see them as being now fulfilled in Christ and in his church.
I think that's a great kind of summary statement there. Not scrapped and started over, but fulfilled and transformed, for kind of just the theme of the whole book and this conversation today. And Father Stephen, I have to say thank you so much for this conversation. This has been an absolute joy and privilege. I've really enjoyed it. I want to end with one final question, which is kind of where the book leaves off, you talk about kind of the apologetic purpose of the book, but we've got a very diverse audience, and I can imagine a lot of people saying, hey, like, maybe I'm not Orthodox, maybe I'm like a high church Anglican, maybe I'm a Catholic, and I'm saying like, yeah, I agree with a lot of this stuff, but I think that the apostles would come to my church. If you kind of had your elevator pitch, if you will, I know this could be like an entire episode on its own, but why Orthodoxy? Is it the beliefs? Is it to this ritual area of the continuity? Like, what is it about the Orthodox Church specifically, amongst other high church liturgical groups, that the apostles would say, that's my church, I recognize that, or that's the faithful continuation of what we started?
I would actually say most of the apostles would actually end up in the Orthodox Jewish synagogue, and that's where, I mean, because I don't believe that the Pauline Christianity was true.
Right, and to me, it's a question of the whole package, right? I don't think that there is an antithesis between the Orthodox Church and the other churches you mentioned, and other ones you could mention, right? Where these are opposites, right? But it's a question to me of the fullness of the faith, sort of nothing left out, right? Everything preserved, and there are, for example, many Roman Catholics who will look at the Orthodox Church and recognize, for example, there are a lot of things they're still doing that we used to do that we maybe don't anymore. But the analogy I use when I'm talking to friends and family members who are Christians but not Orthodox Christians is my maybe now infamous turkey sandwich example, which is that other forms of Christianity sometimes could be compared to this analogy to a really good turkey sandwich. It's filling, it's nourishing, right? The bread is fresh, the turkey is fresh, right? Everything there is good, and it's feeding you. But when I talk about the Orthodox Church in this metaphor, I say in the next room over, there's a whole Thanksgiving dinner laid out, and people are enjoying it, right? So still turkey, right? Still the vegetables, still bread, right? Still those things, but more besides, and more fullness to it, and more richness and depth to it. It's not that I don't think those other groups and those other communities could gain more of that. They could become more full orbed and more encompassing of all of life and of ritual and those things. I just think that if they did that, they start to look more and more like the Orthodox Church. And that would be the way it progresses. And I think that would be a good thing, if we could all move, in that direction. But so, yeah, that would be my sort of short elevator pitch version, I guess.
That's a great illustration. I have a feeling if people haven't heard it before, it will now stick with them because it's a great visual. Once again, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on the channel. I know many people have been looking forward to this, not least of which being myself. I've really been looking forward to this, and I know it won't disappoint them, and it did not disappoint me. I'd love to let you kind of finish off by just letting people know where they can find your work, if it's not sold out, and just anything like that.
Yeah, by the time you're seeing this, there should be physical.
Okay, I think that should do it. Wow, spent 2.5 hours on this. No problem whatsoever with the questions. Honestly, I think that's one of the few things that I can offer people. Obviously, it's not the high production values or the beauty of my voice. We'll probably ask you more about that on the Discord server, Miles. I am going to hang around for a while. If people have questions or anything like that, please feel free to include it in the chat on any of the various platforms. Still wondering if the numbers on Rumble are even close to correct. It says 6 people are watching right now, which seems difficult for me to believe. And I have no clue if anybody ever watches my stuff on Twitch or not. In any case, yeah. Well, it's funny. I was kind of thinking along the same lines. Yeah, turkey dinner is very, very nice, but honestly, Shabbat is, I think, something completely different. I don't know if it would speak to other people the way it does to me, though. So, yeah, I mean, we have to find our place um, in relation to God, and so I think it's individual, and I think that's important. Um, yeah. If people have questions either on the Discord or in any of the chats, please feel free to include them. I am very happy to see you join the Discord, Miles, and um, to see you participating in this community. I hope, yeah. I mean, if you found what I have to say insightful, then that's honestly, I'm so glad about that. Pastor Tanner is actually uh, he is also streaming right now on Twitch. If people are interested, about 2 weeks ago. Oh, very. You're from Portugal. So I actually, yeah. So I have um a weekly live stream on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Pacific. I live in Los Angeles. Um, and hopefully we're gonna have more uh stuff. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff. I usually recommend trying the Jonah playlist that I have. Um, I do speak Spanish, so I I even considered maybe trying to do um some teaching of Hebrew and Spanish. I just don't know if my Spanish is strong enough, and if um it's a good use of what I'm trying to keep limited time. I mean, I did not expect to spend 2.5 hours on this. Um, but yeah. So welcome, Ricardo. If you have questions or anything, feel free to show up during the live streams. Um, Also, I'm available on the Discord, and hopefully our community is one where people are helping each other. So yeah, Portuguese. A lot of people in Iberia are descended from Jews, and it's actually, I mean, especially people who have done their DNA testing, they've found a lot of uh, people. I mean, obviously because of everything that happened during the Inquisition and all that. Um, I'm actually, and Paul Vanderklay, who you may not be aware of, he's also we're both descended from people who um, are part of the Spanish diaspora of Jews. Uh, well, almost all Jews are actually. I mean, because pretty much, I mean, there's been enough intermingling that everybody has one ancestor who got kicked out of Spain. So yeah, that's a very generous offer of you, Ricardo. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know. I mean, hopefully, if you can learn Hebrew, maybe you could start teaching Hebrew and Portuguese or Spanish. There is a channel for people who actually are trying to learn. Um, so my channel is more geared towards allowing people to engage with the Hebrew, even if they're not trying to learn biblical Hebrew full time. There's a channel, Aleph with Beth, where they're it's completely in Hebrew, so it's not language dependent. So it's not like you need to know English in order to understand. There, it's immersive teaching of biblical Hebrew, and I think they do a great job. I really do. And uh, while I certainly, I mean, I disagree with their use of the holy name, but other than that, I think it's a great resource. And yeah, my channel is more geared towards helping people engage with the the Hebrew text using the various tools that are available online. And mostly, I mean, these rants and stuff, I've done kind of trying to get people interested in learning Hebrew. Um, and for some reason, people decide to watch my rants, which I'm very appreciative of. Great. I actually have to go. I got a phone call I have to return. Yeah. So I